subjective idealism or naturalism. The spiritual devastation that results from these three ways of approaching philosophy is truly terrible. They result in a relativism which is made absolute. This is how the creative power of knowledge is destroyed and the discovery of meaning becomes impossible. It is enslavement of philosophy by science, scientific terrorism. Philosophy sees the world from the point of view of man, while science sees the world apart from man. To free philosophy from all anthropological ideas would be to destroy it. Naturalism also sees the world from the point of view of man, but it does so secretly and will not admit it. It is not true that being, interpreted objectively, has primacy over man. On the contrary, man has primacy over being, since being is revealed only in and through man. And it is only in man that spirit is revealed. The conception of being which is not spirit, and is without and not within, results in the tyranny of naturalism. Philosophy easily becomes abstract one. The view worked out by Meyerson in his De Vie Explication dans les Sciences concerning the ontological character of science seems to me mistaken. Science is pragmatic, and loses touch with the sources of life. This happens whenever it seeks knowledge outside man instead of in and through him. Man has his roots in life, in first life, and is given revelations concerning its mysteries. It is only at those depths that philosophy comes into contact with religion, but it does so freely and from within. Philosophy is based upon the assumption that the world is part of man, and not vice versa. If man were merely a small and fragmentary part of the world, the audacious idea of knowledge could never have occurred to him. This truth is implicit in science, too, but it is foreign to scientific method. Knowledge of reality in and through man has nothing to do with subjective idealism, which, on the contrary, confines man to the objectified world of nature. Considered psychologically, man is but a fragmentary part of the world. It is not subjective idealism but transcendental anthropologism which is meant here. It is strange to forget that I, the knower, the philosopher, am a human being. Transcendental man is the presupposition of philosophy, and to ignore this means either nothing at all or the death of philosophical knowledge. Man is an existent, he has being and is a part of being, but being is conformable to man, and this is why I can discover in it meaning which is commensurable with me and my understanding. In so far as Husserl's phenomenological method is intended to do away with the human element in knowledge, it must be pronounced invalid, in spite of its merits in other respects. It has led to excellent results in anthropology, ethics, ontology, M. Skeeler, N. Hartmann, Heidegger, and has brought philosophy out of the cul-de-sac in which the neo-Kantian theory of knowledge landed it. But Husserl's phenomenology is connected with a particular form of Platonism, with the conception, namely, of an ideal non-human realm, and this is its weakness. Knowledge does not consist in man's passively receiving into himself the objects of knowledge, ideal, non-human entities, Wesson Hitten. It implies man's spiritual creative activity. The meaning of things is revealed not through their entering into man who is passive in relation to them, but through man's creative activity reaching out to meaning beyond an unmeaning world. There is no meaning in the solid, concrete world of objects. Meaning is only revealed in man's activity and implies that reality is conformable to man. Non-human ideal being is meaningless. Meaning is in the spirit and not in things or in nature. Being is conformable to man inasmuch as it is spiritual. In spite of its passive and non-human character, Husserl's method is valuable because it is directed upon being and not upon constructions of thought. Man's creativeness does not mean that he construes a world of his own. Meaning is to be found not in the object which enters the mind, and not in the subject who construes a mental world, but in the spiritual world which is neither objective nor subjective but is pure activity and spiritual dynamics. The process of knowledge is a real event, and meaning is revealed in it actively, i.e., the darkness of being becomes light. Knowledge is spiritual life and a part of the reality which is being known. To subject and object in the spiritual world which is neither in knowledge. German epistemologists always talk about the subject and the object, the subjective and the objective. Knowledge for them is objectification. The knowing subject is not an existent, he is an epistemological and not an ontological entity. He is the bearer of ideal logical forms which are not human at all and whose connection with man is incomprehensible. Concrete reality disappears and is replaced by the subject and object. The knower is not a self, not a concrete particular person, but an epistemological subject which is not human and does not exist but is outside existence and stands over against it. And that which he knows is not an existent either, but an object correlative to him and specially constructed for knowledge. Existence slips away both from the subject and the object. The very opposition of the two does away with existence. Objectification destroys life and being. If knowledge is objectification, it can never reach its goal. This is the tragedy of knowledge, which many philosophers have clearly recognized and formulated as follows: existence is irrational and individual, but we can only know the rational and the general. Point 1. The object proves to be utterly alien to the subject and opposed to it. They are logically correlative and cannot be separated one from the other, and yet they are forever opposed to each other. If Plato or early Christianity or German mysticism become an object of knowledge for me, I cannot understand them or discover any meaning in them. To objectify is to destroy meaning. In order to understand meaning, one must enter into it, and this communion is not objectification. Point 2. This is perfectly clear in the so-called spiritual sciences, where objectification invariably means the end of true knowledge. With the natural sciences the case is somewhat different, but I am not concerned with that at the moment. 1. This is particularly insisted on by Wendell Band's and Rickard's school of thought. 2. That which Levi-Bruhl regards as characteristic of primitive mentality, communion with the content known, participation in it, is, as a matter of fact, true knowledge of reality. See his remarkable book, Les Fonctionnements dans les Sociétés Inférieures. The fundamental problem of epistemology is to determine who the knower is and whether he belongs to the realm of existence. Its business is to find a new and deeper meaning in the inevitable presupposition that knowledge is a human activity. Kant and the idealists maintain that man is not the knower, for if he were, knowledge would be relative, and the world is not that which is known, for if it were, we should be committed to naive realism. Theories of knowledge which date back to Kant substitute for the problem of man and of his power to know reality the problem of transcendental consciousness, of the epistemological subject, world spirit, or divine reason. Or, if they are not concerned with transcendental consciousness, they study the psychological contents of consciousness. But neither the transcendental self nor the series of psychic events is man. Epistemology refuses to study man as a knower and abandons him to psychology or sociology. And yet the fundamental question of knowledge is that of the relation between transcendental consciousness or the epistemological subject and man as a concrete and living personality. Kant's services to epistemology are invaluable, but he has not solved its problems. He has not really answered the challenge or skepticism or relativism. The a priori forms which are supposed to vindicate the validity of knowledge have no direct relation to the concrete man who is the knower. Transcendental consciousness may have perfectly firm and secure grounds for knowledge, but then man's consciousness is not transcendental, it consists of mental events and is therefore doomed to be relative. Kant does not show how the transcendental consciousness gains possession of the psychical or how the latter can rise to the transcendental level. As a concrete living being struggling with the stupendous task of knowledge, I derive little comfort from the fact that there is a transcendental unity of consciousness with its a priori forms, and that in that superhuman realm skepticism and relativism are defeated from all eternity. What is important to me is that they should be defeated on the human level, by the concrete man and not by the epistemological subject. I want myself to have knowledge, instead of leaving it to the epistemological subject or to world reason. I want knowledge as a creative activity of man. The theory of knowledge must become a philosophical anthropology and concern itself with man and not with the transcendental ego. But it must study man from the spiritual and ontological point of view and not from the point of view of psychology or sociology. It is no consolation to me to know that there exists a universal reason, if I do not understand what connection it has with my human reason. Nor is it any use to have theories about God which fail to teach of the effects of His grace upon man and the world. I ask, then, what grace or light does transcendental consciousness or the world spirit throw upon man as a living, concrete personality? How are the permanence and validity of knowledge manifested not in the superhuman realm, but in the individual man? This is the fundamental question. Neither Kant nor Hegel has given a satisfactory answer to it. According to Hegel, it is not man who is the knower, but the world reason or world spirit, or, in the last resort, the deity itself. True, the self-consciousness and self-knowledge of the deity are achieved in and through man, but what comfort is it to me? The theory that in man the deity comes to know itself and that the world spirit attains its highest development in philosophy might appear highly gratifying to man's pride and his sense of dignity, but it leaves him no independence whatever. Man is merely a function of the world spirit, the world reason, or the deity, merely a means or an instrument for the realization of ends that are not human at all. Nor does Husserl's ideal being save us from relativism and scepticism. Philosophy is saved from man, but man is not saved from it. According to Husserl, in order to know an object we must renounce everything human, become entirely passive and make it possible for the object to speak within us. In the act of cognition man must cease to exist. Knowledge takes place in the realm of ideal logical being and not in the human realm. There is more truth in the view of St. Thomas Aquinas, for although he belittles man, including him among the lower intellects, he does concern himself with the case of human knowledge. The essential and fundamental problem is the problem of man, of his knowledge, his freedom, his creativeness. Man is the key to the mystery of knowledge and of existence. He is the enigmatic being which, though a part of nature, cannot be explained in terms of nature and through which alone it is possible to penetrate into the heart of being. Man is the bearer of meaning, although he is a fallen creature in whom meaning is distorted. But fall can only be from a height, and the very fall of man is a token of his greatness. Even in his fallen state he retains the mark of his high origin and remains capable of a higher faith and of knowledge which rises above the meaningless world of things. Philosophy is bound to center round man. There are ontological grounds for this. Man cannot be left out of knowledge, but he must be raised from the physical and the psychical to the spiritual level. The gulf between transcendental consciousness, the epistemological subject, the ideal logical being and the concrete living man makes knowledge impossible. I, a man, want to know reality, and the knowledge which may be attained in non-human realms is nothing to me. I, the knower, abide in reality from the very first and am an inalienable part of it. I know reality in and through myself, as man. Only an existent can know existence. If knowledge were not existence to begin with, it could never get at existence. Knowledge takes place in being and is an event within being, a change in it. Both the knower and the knowledge are real. Knowledge is a light within being. It therefore has a cosmogonic character. When philosophers seek intuition, they seek knowledge which is not objectified but is communion with being, penetration into its depths. Intuition may be understood in an active sense and not merely passively as by Husserl or Bergson. Knowledge does / mean that being enters into the knower who is outside being. If the knower is a part of being, knowledge is active and means a change in being. Knowledge is spiritual activity. Objectification in knowledge implies that the knower and the known are mutually alien. It results in knowledge ceasing to be something and becoming merely about something. To be about something means to be an object of knowledge. The knowing subject confronted with being that has been thus objectified can no longer be something, but is excluded from being. When knowledge is about something, the question as to its ontological reality and value cannot be properly asked. When ideas are approached from a historical or psychological point of view, there is no point in asking whether the world to which those ideas refer is real. Has the world in which the thought of Plotinus dwelt any reality? What is essential to knowledge is that we should know God himself and not ideas about God, i.e., that we should know the Spirit and in the Spirit. But this is utterly impossible if there be objectification. In this respect there is an essential difference between natural sciences and sciences of the spirit. In natural sciences, objectification does not destroy the object of knowledge, since nature, which these sciences study, is itself the result of objectification. In making its discoveries, physics deals with the actual real objects and not with their reflections in the human mind. In natural sciences, objectification means finding the real object. They do not result in the same devastation as do the historical or the psychological inquiries into the spirit. In the realm of the spirit, objectification means destruction of the reality which we seek to know, for that reality is not an object. Natural sciences are justified if only by their practical results which could not have been attained had the sciences no relation to reality. Philosophy and the humanities lead to no practical results. Knowledge of the spirit itself and not of human thoughts and mental states cannot be objectified. In philosophy, which is knowledge of the spirit, there must be an inner kinship between the knower and the known. There must be creative spiritual experience and a recognition of the reality of the spirit. Knowledge of truth is communion with truth and life in it. Knowledge of righteousness is communion with righteousness and life in it. Knowledge of the spirit is something and not about something. But the psychological and the historical treatment of philosophy involve objectification, and therefore the reality of the spirit disappears. Consciousness presupposes the subject-object relation, hence philosophical knowledge which transcends objectification and relativity is rooted in subconsciousness and rises to superconsciousness. Ethics occupies a very important, indeed a central place among spiritual sciences. Ethical knowledge can least of all be objectified and be about something, about an object standing over against me as something alien to me. If the moral reality which I wish to know be thus objectified, it disappears completely. It is impossible to posit a value as an object of knowledge without making a valuation, i.e., without making a creative spiritual act. Theoretical and practical reason are this case indivisible. Knowledge of value cannot be separated from valuation, i.e., from life in the world of values. Moral life is not an event in nature and cannot be discovered among the series of such events. Moral faith presupposes freedom. A moral valuation is always a free act. Freedom can never be found solely in the known, but must be present in the knower as the very basis of his being. The phenomenological method goes further than the psychological and the historical and seeks to arrive at that which truly is. It requires keen insight into reality capable of penetrating to the meaning of phenomena. It may be useful in ethics, as can be seen from the work of M. Skeeler and N. Hartman, and yet phenomenology cannot provide a basis for ethics, for it does not take into account man as a knower. It assumes that we can take up a cognitive attitude enabling an object to enter our consciousness. A systematic application of the phenomenological method would always make an intuitive description of an object possible, but the point is that ethical objects cannot be described in this way at all. They are only revealed to the person who performs creative acts of valuation. The person cognizing an ethical object cannot be in a passive state and simply receive that object into his mind. If he did, the object would disappear. N. Hartman could write his Ethic, a remarkable book in many respects, only because he was engaged in a moral struggle and performed creative spiritual acts. His morally grounded atheism is an expression of that struggle. M. Skeeler in his Der Formalismus in der Ethik und die Material Wertethik makes discoveries in moral knowledge only because he is engaged in defending the value of personality. The adherents of the phenomenological method do not remain true to it, and this is why they achieve results that have ethical and ontological value. But Husserl, who is faithful to the method he has invented, has not made any discoveries by means of it. The mystery of knowledge is that in the act of knowing the knower transcends the object of knowledge. Knowledge always means transcendence of the object and creative possession of it. Knowledge must be a source of light and shed it over reality. Hence reality is enriched by knowledge. Moral knowledge inevitably strives to better reality. This does not mean, of course, that the knower must think of himself as being on a high moral level. It simply means that he must save moral experience and through it obtain light for himself, even though it be a single ray. There is something profoundly tragic in knowledge thus understood. Knowledge of God is difficult and in a sense impossible. We must inevitably arrive at negative results in theology and recognize that the positive method is vain and fruitless. God cannot be an object of knowledge because in the act of knowing man cannot rise above God. In moral knowledge we not merely receive moral truth into our minds, reflecting it as in a mirror, we also create it, building up the world of values. We cannot, however, create God. We can only be united to Him, serve Him with our creative activity, answer His call. Knowledge requires great daring. It means victory over ancient, primeval terror. Fear makes the search for truth and the knowledge of it impossible. Knowledge implies fearlessness. Those who stand in awe of traditional moral ideas and valuations, which always have a social origin, are incapable of creative moral knowledge. Conquest of fear is a spiritual cognitive act. This does not imply, of course, that the experience of fear is not lived through. On the contrary, it may be deeply felt, as was the case with Kierkegaard, for instance. Point 1. But the creative achievement of knowledge is victory over fear. The task of ethics is not to draw up a HST of traditional moral norms, but to have the daring to make creative valuations. And it must also be said of knowledge that it is bitter, and there is no escaping that bitterness. Those who love only the sweet are incapable of knowledge. Knowledge can bestow upon us moments of joy and of highest elation, but the fruits of knowledge are bitter. In our world eon, knowledge means exile from Eden, the loss of paradisaical bliss. Particularly bitter is moral knowledge, the knowledge of good and evil. But the one see Kierkegaard, der Begriff der Angst. Angst with him means terror rather than fear. Bitterness is due to the fallen state of the world, and in no way undermines the value of knowledge. The origin of the distinction between good and evil will be discussed further on, but in defining the nature of ethical knowledge it must be said that the very distinction between good and evil is a bitter distinction, the bitterest thing in the world. Dostoevsky says that devilish good and evil cost us too dearly. X knowledge means fearlessness and victory over fear, it is bitter and means acceptance of bitterness. Moral knowledge is the most bitter and the most fearless of all. For in it sin and evil are revealed to us along with the meaning and value of life. There is a deadly pain in the very distinction of good and evil, of the valuable and the worthless. We cannot rest in the thought that that distinction is ultimate. The longing for God in the human heart springs from the fact that we cannot bear to be faced forever with the distinction between good and evil and the bitterness of choice. Ethics occupies a central place in philosophy because it is concerned with sin, with the origin of good and evil and with moral valuations. And since these problems have a universal significance, the sphere of ethics is wider than is generally supposed. It deals with meaning and value, and its province is the world in which the distinction between good and evil is drawn, valuations are made and meaning is sought. 3. The task of ethics. Abstract a priori systems of ethics have little value. The basis of ethics is moral experience, which, indeed, is the basis of philosophy as a whole. A dialectic which does not rest upon any moral experience is simply an intellectual game. Plato's philosophy was inspired by moral motives, the quest for the highest good. Hegel's dialectic was an expression of genuine moral experience. But a priori principles in ethics really imply the rejection of moral experience. Kant denies moral experience in theory. Though, like every true philosopher, he has had it in life. Ethics cannot be merely a theoretical philosophical discipline, for it is also a moral and spiritual activity. It was that for Plato, Spinoza, Fichte, and others. Ethical knowledge has a morally liberating significance. It is the final stage of the philosophy of the spirit, the harvest of a philosophical life. Christian ethics is often identified with the doctrine of the means of salvation, but ethics cannot be merely a soteriology, it is also a theory of values, of man's creative activity. Man is a creative being as well as a being seeking salvation. 1. This is the main theme of L. Shestov's writings. I should like to work out a system of ethics which is not tyrannical, i.e. not normative. All normative theories of ethics are tyrannical. My book is an attempt to give a concrete presentation of human life, its meaning, aims and values. Such a presentation inevitably has man for its center. Ethics must be both theoretical and practical, i.e. it must call for the moral reformation of life and a revaluation of values as well as for their acceptance. And this implies that ethics is bound to contain a prophetic element. It must be a revelation of a clear conscience, unclouded by social conventions, it must be a critique of pure conscience. Ethics is axia logi, the theory of meaning and values. But meaning and values are not passively given, they are created. The theory of values is rooted in the highest value, which is a power radiating gracious regenerating energy. Ethics teaches about value as a force, as the highest good and the source of all power, in this sense it is ontology as well as axiology. This is why it cannot be merely normative, for a norm as such is powerless. Ethics is concerned not with abstract, impotent norms and laws, but with real moral forces and qualities which have power. And Hartmann's Ethic, the most interesting modern work on the subject, seems to me to be logically unfounded, for his ideal values are, as it were, suspended in a vacuum. He has no explanation to give of the origin of man's freedom, nor of his power to realize values in the world. Man is for him the mediator between the world of permanent ideal values and the meaningless natural world. Through his freedom man must introduce into the world purposes and value borrowed from the timeless ideal realm. Such a conception of the moral life is utterly unintelligible. In postulating atheism as the morally necessary condition of man's freedom in realizing values, Hartmann is bound to admit the impotence of values and of goodness, or, in other words, to end in normative idealism. He thinks it an advantage that value is not based upon any ontological reality. But Hartmann is right in widening the domain of ethics and including in it relations to every kind of value, whether it be cognitive or aesthetic. Man's relations to truth and to beauty unquestionably have a moral character. We have a moral duty towards truth and beauty. A cognitive or an artistic activity is not in itself moral, but our attitude towards it implies a moral activity. Ethics embraces everything that is connected with human freedom, i.e., with freely made distinctions and valuations. A free moral act may refer not only to what is generally called moral life, but to man's spiritual fate as a whole and to all its values. Ethics is knowledge of the spirit and not of nature, and is concerned with manifestations of spiritual freedom and not of natural necessity. The spiritual world is known in a different way from the natural. Ethics has a scientific aspect. It draws upon the material provided by the history of culture, sociology, mythology, mental pathology, etc. But it is a philosophical discipline and has all the characteristics of philosophical as distinct from scientific knowledge. Ethics is bound to be prophetic, and, what is even more important, it is bound to be personal. The present book deliberately presents a personal view, for it springs from life and not from abstractions. For the fundamental problem of ethics, the criterion of good and evil, the fundamental problem of ethics is that of the criterion of good and evil, of the genesis of morality and the origin of moral distinctions and valuations. It is a very different question from the one asked by evolutionists who inquire into the origin and development of moral ideas. It is an infinitely deeper question. How does the distinction itself come out? How can the good be the criterion of it, when the good comes to be only after the distinction has been made? The highest value lies beyond good and evil. The force of the question is not often seen. As a rule, ethics is entirely on the side of good and evil, and the good is not a problem for it. Nietzsche did see the full force of it. He said that the will to truth is the death of morality. It is the business of ethics both to provide a basis for morality and to show up its falsity. The paradoxality of the problem lies in the fact that the good is called into doubt and the question is asked whether it is not really evil. Gogol has given a masterly expression to the paradox in the words used as an epigraph to the present book: it is sad not to see any good in goodness. But in asking the question, is the good good? I still remain in the realm of yeah and nay, of distinction and valuation. Suppose I say that the good is not good, that it is evil, that we must say no to it. That will mean that I make a valuation of the good, and distinguish it from something which I oppose to it and which lies beyond this good and this evil. If I regard that which is beyond good and evil as higher than that which is on this side of good and evil, I distinguish between the higher and the lower, I condemn, I appraise, I draw comparisons. And, of course, Nietzsche was a moralist, though he denied it. Beyond good and evil he discovered either a higher morality, thus remaining still bound by moral determinations, or the same evil as on this side, exemplified, for instance, by the figure of Caesar Borgia. In either case he failed to break away from the distinction between good and evil. And so did the Hottentot, who defined good and evil by saying, "It is good if I steal somebody else's wife and bad if my wife is stolen from me." That Hottentot was a moralist, and there are many like him among us. The old good is replaced by the new good, values are revalued, but none of these changes take us beyond good and evil. Even if we say that the distinction and valuation are themselves an evil, we are still wholly within their power. Beyond there should be neither good nor evil, but we are always up against one or the other. We shall reach a more satisfactory result when we grasp that our valuations relating to good and evil are symbolic and not real. Good and evil, the moral and the immoral, the high and the low do not express any real existent, but are merely symbols, not arbitrary or conventional symbols, however, but reasonable and inevitable. In its inmost being, reality is neither good nor evil, neither moral nor immoral, but it is symbolized in this way in accordance with the categories of this world. The world is not the ultimate reality but only a phase of it, a phase in which being is alienated from itself and everything is expressed by symbols. The spatial symbols of high and low may express absolute truths of the moral and spiritual order. That which in reality is not separate assumes in our fallen world the form of division. In reality, there is neither high nor low, but the symbol of height does give us some insight into the nature of reality. The same thing is true of the generic symbols of Father and Son, which express the truths of regius revelation. Father, Son, birth are words borrowed from our earthly life, but they are used, rightly and inevitably, to express the truth about the divine faith. God as being in itself is neither father nor son, and no birth takes place in him, and yet something expressed by those symbols has an absolute significance. Only in pure mysticism and spirituality is symbolism overcome, and we are plunged into first faith. Our ethics is symbasy, and so are all its distinctions and valuations. The problem is how to pass from symbols to reality. That he's on this side of good and evil is symbasy, only that which is beyond good and evil is real. The symbolism of good and evil is not artificial, accidental, or wrong. It tells us about absolute, about the ultimate reality, but does so darkly, reflecting it, as it were, in the mirror of the world. The very existence of moral faith with its distinctions and valuations presupposes freedom. Hence ethics is a philosophy of freedom. The traditional scholastic doctrine of free will does not touch on the real problem of freedom. That doctrine was invented in order to find a culprit, one who could be held responsible and so vindicate the idea of punishment in this faith and in eternity. The doctrine of free will was modeled to suit a normative, legistic morality. It implies that man is confronted with the choice between good and evil, and may or may not fulfill the law or norm imposed upon him. Man will be justified if he chooses the good and fulfills the law, and condemned if he chooses evil and fails to fulfill the law. High spite of a certain confusion of thought, there is profound truth in Luther's rebellion against justification by works connected with free will. 1. It is paradoxical that so-called free will should be the source of man's enslavement. Man is enslaved by the necessity to choose between that which is forced upon him and carrying out the law under fear of penalties. He proves to be least free in that which is connected with his free will, yet freedom may be understood not merely as the possibility given to man of fulfilling the law and justifying himself by good works due to his free will, but as man's creative energy resulting in the production of values. Freedom may lead man to evil. It is tragic in character and does not come under any pedagogical or morally legistic categories. Freedom is the essential condition of moral faith, freedom in evil as well as in good. There can be no moral faith without freedom in evil, and this renders moral life a tragedy and makes ethics a philosophy of tragedy. Legalistic, normative ethics, for which freedom is merely the condition of fulfilling the moral law, leaves out of account the tragic aspect of moral faith. Tragedy is an essential element of morality and a fundamental ethical category. It is the tragic that leads us to the depths and heights, beyond good and evil in the normative sense. The tragic springs from freedom and is neither good nor evil in the sense in which these terms are usually defined in ethics, yet ethics must inquire into it. Ethics has to deal both with the tragic and the paradoxical. Moral faith is made up of paradoxes in which good and evil are intertwined. They cannot be solved rationally, but have to be lived through to the end. The tragic and paradoxical character of ethics is due to the fact that its fundamental problem is not that of the moral norm or of the good, but of the relation between the divine and the human freedom. Ethics is not only bound up with sociology, but dominated by sociology. This is not the result of the 19th and 20th century positivism or of the work of Auguste Comte and Durkheim. It is due to the tyranny which social life and social norms exercise over the moral faith of man throughout the world. The terrorism of the social unit, the power of society over the individual, is to be found almost everywhere in history. 1. See Luther's De Servo Arbitrio, the most remarkable of his works, and dates back to primitive community. Even Christianity has not been able to free man from it entirely. When Westermarck wrote his Origin and Development of Moral Ideas from the scientific and positivist point of view, he wrote a book on sociology and not on ethics. Moral ideas have a social origin and develop in accordance with social laws laid down by the community. Ethics, customs are investigated by social sciences. The social origin of moral consciousness is affirmed not only by positivists who reject all metaphysics, it is upheld by metaphysicians, since sociality is a metaphysical category. This is what Heidegger means by das Man. 1. It is das Man, the social whole, the common life of every day that reigns in the fallen sinful world. Society plays an enormous part in moral consciousness, and it is the difficult task of philosophical ethics to distinguish between the spiritual and the social elements in moral life and to reveal the pure conscience. The ethical problem must be freed from social terrorism. The social element is so important to the moral life that people often ascribe a moral character to facts of purely social origin, to social manners and customs. But in its essence the moral is independent of the social. A purely moral fact does not depend upon society, or depends upon it only in so far as society itself is moral. Moral life is rooted in the spiritual world, and social relations are merely a projection of it. The moral is the explanation of the social and not vice versa. Moral faith is not merely personal, it is also social. But the purity of moral consciousness is permanently vitiated by what I call the herd element in social faith. The 19th and 20th century systems of ethics which take society to be the source of moral valuations and distinctions and affirm the social character of good and evil are obviously involved in a vicious circle. Society cannot be the supreme value and the final end of human life. Even if it were possible to prove that the distinction between good and evil had a social origin, this would throw no light on the nature of moral valuation. The object of philosophical ethics is to know not the origin and development of ideas about good and evil, but good and evil as such. What matters to it is the ontological nature of good and evil, and not man's ideas about them. The modern mind is so demoralized by the historical and the psychological methods of approaching the subject that it finds it difficult to distinguish the problem of the good as such from that of human ideas about the good, beginning with the Hottentot morality and ending with Kant and Comte. The ideas about good and evil embodied in manners and morals depend upon society, but good and one see his Zeit. If we observe the distinction drawn by Tönnies between Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft, it is to Gesellschaft that I am referring. Evil in themselves do not depend upon it, on the contrary, social institutions depend upon the ultimate nature of good and evil. It may be objected that my knowledge of the good is only my idea which forms part of the general body of opinion about it. This is the usual argument of relativism. My ideas about the good may be mistaken and in that sense they are relative. But it would be meaningless to form ideas about a good which did not exist, just as it would be meaningless to have knowledge which did not refer to any reality. Moral valuations inevitably presuppose a moral realism and imply that the good exists and is not merely my idea. And it is utterly impossible to substitute society for the good. Durkheim tried to put society in the place of God, but this is the most monstrous form of idolatry. 1 Society itself stands in need of moral valuation and supposes the distinction between good and evil. Social utilitarianism has been completely exploded and need not be discussed here. To be consistent, a sociological theory of morality ought, following Durkheim, to recognize society as God, and not as a natural and historical part of a world plunged in sin. It is indisputable that man is a social being, but he is also a spiritual being. He belongs to two worlds. It is only as a spiritual being that man can know the good as such. As a social being he knows only the changing conceptions about the good. A sociology which denies that man is a spiritual being, deriving his valuations from the spiritual world, is not a science but a false philosophy and even a false religion. It is only as a being which rises above the stream of the naturally historical and psychical life that man can make valuations and see goodness, truth, and beauty. This means not that ethics must disregard the social aspect of life, but that social life must be grounded in morality, and not morality in social life. Nor can ethics depend upon biology, which, like sociology, claims to be a philosophy of life. A biological philosophy tries to establish a criterion of good and evil and to base moral valuations upon the principle of the maximum of life. Life is the highest good and the supreme value, everything that increases life is good, and everything that decreases it and leads to death and non-being is evil. We ought to work for the utmost possible increase of life. Such a philosophy is different from any form of hedonism. A rich and full life is a good and a value even if it brings with it suffering and not happiness. The greatest representative of this view was Nietzsche, a bitter enemy of hedonism and utilitarianism. Clausius is another thinker who opposes the vital principle to the spiritual. One see his les formes élémentaires de la vie religieuse. Durkheim does seek for a reality corresponding to the religious ideas and finds it in the community. It is certainly indisputable that the good is life and that the final end is the fullness of life. But the trouble is that it is too general. A life cannot be a criterion of value because it is all-embracing. Everything is life and life is everything. Qualitative distinctions and valuations have to be made within life. The maximum of life cannot be the criterion, for it is a quantitative and not a qualitative conception. We are thus involved in a vicious circle. Life may be low and lofty, good and evil, beautiful and hideous. How are we to judge it? The biological criterion of the maximum of life can certainly not serve as a moral criterion. In order to have value and be a blessing, life must have meaning. But meaning cannot be derived from the mere process of life, from its quantitative maximum, it must be in that which is beyond and above life. Valuation from the point of view of meaning always presupposes rising above that which is valued. We are compelled to admit that there is such a thing as true life in contradistinction to the false and fallen life. Life can reach a higher level not through quantitative increase, but through ascending towards something higher than itself. And this means that life may be interpreted spiritually as well as biologically. But a spiritual interpretation presupposes the existence of the divine as well as of the human life. Spiritual life always implies something higher than itself towards which it is ascending. The supreme value and the highest good is not life as such, but spiritual life rising up to God, not the quantity, but the quality of life. Spiritual life is not in the least opposed to, or destructive of, mental and physical life. It transfers the mental and the physical to a higher plane, imparts a higher quality to them and raises them towards the heights, towards that which is beyond life, beyond nature, beyond being. Life may become for us the symbol of the highest value and the highest good, but these are in their turn but symbols of true being, and being itself is but a symbol of the final mystery. Ethics is thus confronted with infinity, and consequently a great deal of it is problematic. The normative ethics is blind to this. The problem of ethics is connected with the mystery of man. Ethics must be the theory of the destiny and vocation of man, and must inquire in the first instance into the nature of man, his origin, and his goal. Chapter 2: The Origin of Good and Evil. God and man. The question of the distinction between good and evil and of its origin cannot be solved apart from the prior question as to the relation between God and man, between the divine and the human freedom, or between grace and freedom. The feud between the Creator and the creature which overshadows our whole existence concerns evil and its origin. And the struggle against the Creator is waged not only by those who distort with evil the image of the created world, but also by those who suffer from the evil in it. The ethical problem presupposes a theodicy, without which there can be no ethics. If there is a distinction between good and evil, and if evil exists, God must be justified, since the justification of God is the solution of the problem of evil. If there were no evil and no distinction between good and evil, there could be no ethics, and no theodicy. Putting it paradoxically, it may be said that ethics judges not only man, but God also. The good as well as the wicked rebel against God, for they cannot reconcile themselves to the existence of evil. Atheism may spring from good motives and not solely from evil ones. 1. The wicked hate God because he prevents them from doing evil, and the good are ready to hate him for not preventing the wicked from doing evil and following the existence of evil. The very distinction between good and evil which is the result of the fall becomes the source of atheism. Ethics springs from the same source as atheism, and this throws a sinister hght upon it. The traditional doctrines of rheology do not solve the painful problem of evil. The ordinary theological conception of the creation of the world and the fall turns it all into a divine comedy, a play that God plays with himself. One may disagree with Marcion to the Gnostics and the Manichees, but one cannot help respecting them for their being so painfully conscious of the problem of evil. Evil is generally said to be due to the abuse of freedom with which God endowed his creatures. But this explanation is purely superficial. The freedom through which one prud'homme is the type of man who rebels against God in the name of goodness, justice, and righteousness. See his De la Justice dans la Révolution et dans l'Église. 2. See the best of Hamak's works, Marcion. The creature succumbs to evil has been given to it by God, i.e., in the last resort is determined by God. Freedom is a fatal gift which dooms man to perdition. It is impossible to rationalize this idea and to express it in terms of positive theology. It is precisely the traditional theology that leads good men, inspired by moral motives, to atheism. The ordinary theological conception of freedom in no way saves the Creator from the responsibility for pain and evil. Freedom itself is created by God and penetrable to him down to its very depths. In his omniscience, ascribed to him by positive theology, God foresaw from all eternity the fatal consequences of freedom with which he endowed man. He foresaw the evil and suffering of the world which has been called into being by his will and is wholly in his power. He foresaw everything, down to the perdition and ever-lasting torments of many. And yet he consented to create man and the world under those terrible conditions. This is the profound moral source of atheism. In expecting an answer to his call from man whom he endowed with freedom, God is expecting an answer from himself. He knows the answer beforehand and is only playing with himself. When in difficulties, positive theology falls back upon mystery and finds refuge in negative theology. But the mystery has already been over-rationalized. The logical conclusion is that God has from all eternity predetermined some to eternal salvation and others to eternal damnation. 1. Calvin's horrible doctrine has the great merit of being a reductio ad absurdum. He clearly says that which inevitably follows from the traditional doctrine of creation. True, predetermination itself is an impenetrable mystery, terrifying to reason and conscience, but we are led to it by rational theology. Positive theology goes too far in rationalizing the mystery, and at the same time it does not go far enough, for it puts limits to knowledge and lays down prohibitions. When we pass to negative theology, we begin to breathe more freely as though coming out of a prison house. Mystery, docta ignorantia, have a profound significance. The whole meaning, importance, and value of life are determined by the mystery behind it, by an infinity which cannot be rationalized but can only be expressed in myths and symbols. God is the infinite mystery that underlies existence, and this alone makes the pain and evil of faith endurable. They would be unendurable if the world and man were self-sufficient, if there were nothing beyond, higher and deeper and more mysterious. We come to God not because rational thought demands flees existence, but because the world is bounded by a mystery in which rational thought ends. Consequently, all systems of positive theology are exoteric and do 1 see Calvin, Institution de la Religion Chrétienne. Not touch upon the last things. Mystical negative theology brings us closer to the final depths. The limit to rational thought is set by a mystery and not by a taboo. The divine nothing or the absolute of the negative theology cannot be the creator of the world. This has been made clear by German speculative mysticism. It is the burden of Eckhardt's doctrine of the Gottheit and of Bohme's conception of the Ungrund. Out of the divine nothing, the Gottheit, or the Ungrund, the Holy Trinity, God the Creator is Bohm. The creation of the world by God the Creator is a secondary act. From this point of view, it may be said that freedom is not created by God, it is rooted in the nothing, in the Ungrund from all eternity. Freedom is not determined by God, it is part of the nothing out of which God created the world. The opposition between God the Creator and freedom is secondary. In the primeval mystery of the divine nothing, this opposition is transcended, for both God and freedom are manifested out of the Ungrund. God the Creator cannot be held responsible for freedom which gave rise to evil. Man is the child of God and the child of freedom, of nothing, of non-being, to p/tjof. Meonic freedom consented to God's act of creation, non-being freely accepted being. But through it man fell away from the work of God, evil and pain came into the world, and being was mixed with non-being. This is the real tragedy both of the world and of God. God longs for his other, FHS friend, he wants him to answer the call to enter the fullness of the divine life and participate in God's creative work of conquering non-being. God does not answer his own call, the answer is from freedom which is independent of him. God the Creator is all-powerful over being, over the created world, but he has no power over non-being, over the uncreated freedom which is impenetrable to him. In the first act of creation God appears as the maker of the world. But that act cannot avert the possibility of evil contained in meonic freedom. The myth of the fall tells of this powerlessness of the Creator to avert the evil resulting from freedom which he has not created. Then comes God's second act in relation to the world and to man. God appears not in the aspect of Creator but of Redeemer and Savior, in the aspect of the suffering God who takes upon himself the sins of the world. God in the aspect of God the Son descends into the abyss, into the Ungrund, into the depths of freedom out of which springs evil as well as every kind of good. This is the only possible interpretation of the mystery of the Incarnation if we are not to interpret it in the juridical sense. Out of the abyss, out of the divine nothing is Bohm the Trinitary God, and he is confronted with meonic freedom. He creates out of nothing the world and man and expects from them an answer to his call, an answer from the depths of freedom. At first the answer was consent to creation, then it was rebellion and hostility towards God, a return to original non-being. All rebellion against God is a return to non-being which assumes the form of false, illusory being, and is a victory of non-being over the divine light. And it is only then that the nothing which is not evil becomes evil. Then comes God's second act, he descends into non-being, into the abyss of freedom that has degenerated into evil. He manifests himself not in power but in sacrifice. The divine sacrifice, the divine self-crucifixion must conquer evil meonic freedom by enlightening it from within without forring it, without depriving the created world of freedom. Only such an interpretation of the divine mystery saves ethics from the danger of atheism. Let it not be said that this is pantheism. Pantheism does contain some truth, and that is the truth of negative theology. But the falsity of pantheism lies in rationalizing the mystery and translating the truth of negative theology into the language of the positive. Mysticism has a language of its own and cannot be directly translated into the language of theology. Pantheism is an instance of such mistranslation. This is why mystics are so often accused of pantheism, and for the most part unjustly. In traditional positive theology there is always a desire to humiliate man. But the existence of evil for which the creature and not the creator is supposed to be responsible makes such humiliation unintelligible. The responsibility for evil exalts man instead of humiliating him. It implies that he has a tremendous power of freedom capable of rising against God, of separating itself from him, of creating hell and a godless world of its own. The idea of the fall is at bottom a proud idea, and through it man escapes from the sense of humiliation. If man fell away from God, he must have been an exalted creature, endowed with great freedom and power. It appears, then, that the only occasion when theologians exalt man is when they speak of the fall and of the responsibility for it. On all other occasions they belittle the creature. The very word creature acquires a deprecatory meaning. The creature is insignificant, impotent, pitiful, helpless, it is nothing. It is as though in creating the world God wanted to humiliate the creature and demonstrate its nothingness and helplessness. All he requires of it is blind submission, and he cruelly punishes disobedience. All this seems to imply that man is essentially sinful, but, as a matter of fact, such a conception of the relation between God and man is simply unintelligible. The ideas of creator and creature are symbols taken from our world. But in our world a work bears its creator's name, expresses his idea and is an embodiment of his energy. There can be no question of the work of a great artist being poor, low, and insignificant simply because it is created. But the creator of the world is the greatest of artists, and there is no reason why it should be denied that he can create something divine and lofty. True, it will be said that God's creatures have spoiled and distorted their own image. But the idea of creation and creature as such does not imply a fallen state. Theologians regard creature as low and insignificant because it is creature and not because it is fallen. The fact of the fall proves, on the contrary, its independence, the extent of its freedom and the power of its determination to be something more than a creature. There ensues a series of insoluble paradoxes. Man's nature is created by God, but his freedom is not created, not determined by any being and is prior to all being. Being springs from freedom and not freedom from being. That which is called the creature's nothingness is precisely that which is uncreated in the creature its freedom, and the rest of its nature is created by God and therefore cannot be called a nothing. Neither the created nature nor the uncreated freedom belittle the creature. What belittles it is the evil that springs from freedom, but that evil is not a constituent part of its nature for it has not been created by God. The slavery of the creature is connected with a monarchic conception of God characteristic of the lower and non-Christian forms of theism. It is the conception of an autocratic master. This is an aspect of God which precedes the Christian revelation. Christianity is not a monotheistic religion like Mohammedanism, it is a trinitary religion. The trinitary conception of God rules out slavery and justifies the freedom and dignity of man. Atheism has often been simply a form of antitheism and a protest against abstract monotheism and monarchism. The Christian trinitary God, the God of love and sacrifice, leaves no room for atheism. The moral consciousness cannot rise against him in the name of the good as it does against the abstract monotheistic God who humiliates his creatures, and endows them with freedom in order to make them responsible for the misuse of it and to punish them cruelly. It is strange that human thought and especially theological thought has never concerned itself with God's inner fate. Probably this was considered impious. The most incomprehensible part of traditional theological theories is the psychology of the deity. These theories were always framed from the human point of view. Theology has been anthropocentric rather than theocentric, and this is particularly true with regard to 27. The monarchic conception of God. Can God be said to have no inner life, no emotional and affective states? The static conception of God as actus purus having no potentiality and completely self-sufficient is a philosophical, Aristotelian, and not a biblical conception. The God of the Bible, the God of the Revelation, is by no means an actus purus. He has affective and emotional states, dramatic developments in his inner life, inward movement, but all this is revealed exoterically. It is extraordinary how limited is the human conception of God. Men are afraid to ascribe to him inner conflict and tragedy characteristic of all life, the longing for his other, for the birth of man, but have no hesitation in ascribing to him anger, jealousy, vengeance and other affective states which, in man, are regarded as reprehensible. There is a profound gulf between the idea of perfection in man and in God. Self-satisfaction, self-sufficiency, stony immobility, pride, the demand for continual submission are qualities which the Christian religion considers vicious and sinful, though it calmly ascribes them to God. It becomes impossible to follow the gospel injunction, "Be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." That which in God is regarded as a sign of perfection, in man is considered an imperfection, a sin. In accordance with the principles of negative theology, God, of course, cannot be described as good or perfect, for he is above goodness or perfection, just as he is above being. He is not something but no thing, and none of our determinations are applicable to him. We can only think of God symbolically and mythologically. And a symbolic psychology of God is possible not in relation to the divine nothing of negative theology, but in relation to God the creator of positive theology. And it is utterly unthinkable to ascribe to God the creator self-sufficiency, self-satisfaction, and despotism as characteristic of his inner life. It is more worthy of God to ascribe to him a longing for the loved one, a need for sacrificial self-surrender. People are afraid to ascribe movement to God, because movement indicates the lack of something, or the need for something which is not there. But it may equally well be said that immobility is an imperfection, for it implies a lack of the dynamic quality of life. Tragic conflict in the life of the deity is a sign of the perfection, and not of the imperfection, of the divine life. The Christian revelation shows us God in the aspect of sacrificial love, but sacrificial love, far from suggesting self-sufficiency, implies the need for passing into its other. It is impossible to deny that the Christian God is first and foremost, the God of sacrificial love, and sacrifice always indicates tragedy. Dramatic movement and tragedy are balm of the fullness, and not of the poverty of fife. To deny tragedy in the divine life is only possible at the cost of denying Christ, his cross and crucifixion, the sacrifice of the Son of God. This is the theology of abstract monotheism. Abstract monarchic monotheism, which refuses to recognize the inner dramatism of the divine life, is a clear instance of the confusion between negative and positive theology. Creation of the world cannot be deduced from the absolute, which is perfectly self-sufficient. Creation of the world implies movement in God, it is a dramatic event in the divine life. It is unthinkable that there should be movement in the absolute, creating an order of being external to it. In the absolute nothing can be thought positively, it admits of negative characteristics only. If the absolute of negative theology be identified with the creator of positive theology, the world proves to be accidental, unnecessary, insignificant, having no relation to the inner life of the deity, and therefore, in the last resort, meaningless. Creature has meaning and dignity only if the creation of the world be understood as the realization of the divine Trinity within the inner life of the absolute, as a mystery of love and freedom. For an exoteric theology, the inner life of the deity does not exist, but an esoteric theology is bound to recognize the presence of tragic conflict in God. It is what Jacob Boehme calls the theogonic process. It takes place in eternity, and signifies not the birth of a previously non-existent God, but a divine mystery play going on in the eternal hidden life of the deity, the perpetual birth of God out of the ungrund. 1. The theogonic process and the presence of tragedy in God presuppose the existence of primeval freedom rooted in nothing, in non-being. On the secondary plane, where there is the creator and the creature, God and man, the uncreated freedom may be thought of as outside God. We may not think of being as outside God, but we may thus think of non-being. This is the only way to understand evil without making God responsible for it. The distinction between being and non-being is merged in the last mystery of the divine nothing. In apophatic knowledge, nothing can be thought of as external to God, neither the created world nor freedom. Pantheism is true in so far as it refers to the God of apophatic theology, but it is false in so far as it translates mystical truth into the language of rationalistic positive theology. The world and the center of the world, man, is the creation of God through wisdom, through divine ideas, and at the same time it is the child of meonic uncreated freedom, the child of fathomless non-being. The element of freedom does not come from God the Father, for it is prior to being. The tragedy in God is connected with freedom. God the Creator has absolute power over being, but not over freedom. Fathom 1. See my studies in Boehme, in Russian, Putno. 20. The destiny of man, less freedom springing from non-being, entered the created world, consenting to the act of creation. God the Creator has done everything to bring light into that freedom, in harmony with his great conception of creation. But without destroying freedom he could not conquer the potency of evil contained in it. This is why there is tragedy and evil in the world. All tragedy is connected with freedom. The tragedy in And we can only reconcile ourselves to the tragedy of the world because God suffers in it too. God shares his creature's destiny. He sacrifices himself for the world and for man whom he loves and yearns for. The conception of createdness and of creature by means of which theologians hope to solve all their difficulties is vague and ambiguous. It is impossible to work out any rational idea of the creation of the world. It is a myth and not an idea. But the myth is too often interpreted as belittling the creature. In the case of man, that which he creates is more expressive of him than that which he begets. The image of the artist and the poet is imprinted more clearly on his works than on his children. The most unintelligible part of the idea of createdness is that it is intended both to establish a gulf between man and his creator and to make man utterly insignificant and entirely dependent upon the creator. The conception of a created freedom is, of course, the most inadmissible of all. The world is created, man is created, but being is uncreated and is from all eternity. This implies that divine being alone is being in the true sense of the term. By comparison with God the world is secondary, by comparison with ontology, cosmology is secondary. The world is either the creation of being which is identical with God or a state of being, a certain eon in its destinies. In the first case the fundamental characteristic of the world is its createdness. It is created out of nothing, and its nothingness springs from that source and not from God. But the conception of createdness throws no light upon the nothing out of which the world is created. If that nothing is primeval uncreated meonic freedom, we are faced with an unfathomable mystery, yet in seeking to penetrate into it we attain results that have more meaning and are less insulting to man than the conclusions of traditional theology. But the mystery can only be approached through myth and not through logical ideas. Perhaps the most important point with regard to the idea of creation is to make clear the meaning of tragedy, for it is the tragic that leads us beyond the confines of the world and brings us nearer to the mystery. There may be two conceptions of tragedy. Pre-Christian tragedy is the hopeless misery and suffering of the innocent. It is the tragedy of fate. It is based upon the interpretation of cosmic life as completely self-contained. There is no supercosmic God to whom the innocent sufferer can appeal. The world is full of gods, but the gods do not rise above the cycle of cosmic life and are themselves subject to the higher power of fate, Molpa. The only way out is through aesthetic reconciliation, through feeling the beauty of hopeless suffering. This is the amor fati, and is a unique, primary category. But is all tragedy that of fate, or is a Christian tragedy possible? One traditional theology is afraid of the very idea of it, though it is curious that the religion of the cross should deny tragedy. As distinct from the ancient tragedy of fate, the Christian tragedy is that of freedom and reveals the primary source of the tragic as such. Fate is secondary and is found in a finite world separated from the first source of being. Fate is the child of freedom, and so is necessity. Freedom is primary. Christian consciousness overcomes fate in the classical sense of the word and frees the human spirit from the power of the world and of cosmic forces. But Christianity reveals freedom, which is the primary source of tragedy. It reveals tragedy in the divine life itself. God himself, the only begotten Son, suffers and is crucified, an innocent sufferer. The tragedy of freedom shows that there is a struggle between the conflicting principles which he deeper than the distinction between good and evil. Fate is the child of freedom. This means that freedom itself is fatal. Christianity does not believe in the power of blind fate, for it reveals to us meaning which transcends the world and rules it, and to which appeal can be made against the pain, the suffering, the fatal happenings of life. But it transfers tragedy to a greater depth, to freedom which is prior to being and deeper than it. Fate is bound up with meonic freedom, with primeval darkness, the ungrund. Three principles are active in the world: providence, i.e., the supercosmic God; freedom, i.e., the human spirit; and fate or destiny, i.e., nature, the solidified, hardened outcome of the dark meonic freedom. The interaction between these three principles constitutes the complexity of the cosmic and the human life. Christianity, too, has to recognize the element of fate, but it does not regard it as supreme and unconquerable. Tragedy means a conflict between polarities, but it need not necessarily be a conflict between good and evil, the divine and the diabolical. True depths of tragedy become apparent when two equally divine principles come into conflict. The whole of my book is devoted to describing conflicts of that type. The greatest tragedy is suffering caused by the good, and not by evil, and consists in our being unable to justify life in terms of 1 C. Hans Ehrenberg, Tragede und Cruz I band. Die Tragede unter dem Olymp. 2 Band die Tragede unter dem Kreuz. The distinction between good and evil. Tragedy existed before the distinction was made and will go on existing after the distinction has been transcended. The most tragic situations in life are conflicts between values which are equally noble and lofty. And this implies that tragedy exists within the divine faith itself. The appearance of evil and of the diabolical is something secondary. The new ethics must be knowledge not only of good and evil, but also of the tragic which is constantly present in moral experience and complicates all our moral judgments. The paradoxality of moral faith is connected with the presence in it of the tragic element which cannot be subsumed under the ordinary categories of good and evil. The tragic is not a result of evil, but is morally guiltless. The Golgotha is the supreme tragedy just because the crucified is absolutely sinless and innocent. It is impossible to moralize about tragedy, for it is beyond good and evil. The tragedy of freedom is overcome by the tragedy of the cross. Death is conquered by death. Judgments which are on the side of good and evil fail to penetrate to the final depths. Man's moral consciousness is blunted both by evil and by spurious, perverted good. Moral purification and regeneration always mean acquiring the unspoiled, virginal power of moral judgment. The paradoxical, tragic, and complex character of moral faith is in the fact that not only evil and the wicked are bad, but that good and the good may be bad also. The good may be evil because they believe in an evil good. Evil is, so to speak, the retribution for spurious good. And this is where tragedy begins. The good who create a hell and relegate the wicked to it are an instance of tragedy. This is deeper than the ordinary distinction between good and evil. God created man in his own image and likeness, i.e., made him a creator too, calling him to free spontaneous activity and not to formal obedience to his power. Free creativeness is the creature's answer to the great call of its creator. Man's creative work is the fulfillment of the creator's secret will. But creativeness by its very nature is creation out of nothing, i.e., out of meonic freedom which is prior to the world itself. This element of freedom springing from the pre-existential abyss is present in every creative act of man, in artistic conception and inspiration. In contradistinction to God, man needs matter for his creativeness. A sculptor needs marble from which to make the statue, but it is not of matter borrowed from the world that creativeness is balm. The element of primeval freedom, the freedom of nothing, always penetrates into the artistic conception. The answer to God's call comes from the depths of that freedom. It is curious that theologians fail to recognize the presence of freedom in artistic creation, and only think of it with reference to the fall, guilt, and punishment. This is the weakness of theological theories which renders them unable to justify man's creative activity and provide a basis for it. The nature of that activity can only be understood by contrasting creation with procreation. One springs from freedom, and the other from the womb of nature. Birth means a separation and redistribution of forces that are already in existence, rather than the making of something that has never existed before. The progenitor puts forth a part of his matter, his nature. The absolutely new arises through creativeness alone, i.e., through freedom which has its roots in non-being. Creation means transition from non-being to being through a free act. Evolutionism does not really admit the possibility of creativeness, for it does not recognize freedom and knows only necessity. Procreation and redistribution are the only changes it allows. It is remarkable that theological theories often coincide with the naturalistic in denying creativeness. Primeval meonic freedom can alone provide an explanation of creativeness as well as of evil. Theology established the distinction between birth and creation for the sake of interpreting the inner life of the Holy Trinity and the creation of the world. The Son is eternally born of the Father, but the world is created by God and not of God. Birth implies a unity of nature, consubstantiality agio avoia, while creation means similarity, aphiocalacra, with difference in nature. But birth and creation have different significance in God and in the world. In the world, birth always means severance and movement along the line of bad infinity, while in God it does not imply any severance. On the other hand, creativeness in the world means the making of something entirely new without any division or lapse into the bad infinity. In the world there is a greater bond between a creator and his work than between parent and child. Birth means pain and suffering as a consequence of the evil disruption of the world. Creation means conformity to the idea of man and to the vocation bestowed upon him by God. The origin of the world and of man becomes intelligible to us only in the light of Christ. The dogma of Christ, the new Adam, is not merely a dogma of salvation, and the coming of Christ means more than redemption from sin. Apart from Christ and the Trinitary principle, the creation of the world cannot be understood. It cannot be deduced from a monarchic conception of God. Creation of the world can only be interpreted in the light of the mystery of the Holy Trinity. The Lamb is slain from the foundation of the world. The divine sacrifice forms part of the plan of creation from the first. Redemption is a second stage in the world history, a new relation of God to his creature, a fuller, higher, and more perfect revelation of the deity as sacrificial love, i.e., a new moment in the development of the world and of man. The problem of creativeness is first and foremost the problem of freedom, and freedom of the creature becomes completely intelligible to us only through the God-man, i.e. through the revelation of the sacrificial aspect of God. Pantheism is false if only because it is bound to deny freedom. But dualistic theism denies it, too, or admits it solely for the sake of man's moral responsibility. Gnostic and Manichaean dualism also denies freedom, for it finds the source of evil in an evil God or in matter. It must be admitted that in the antinomies of the creator and the creature, freedom appears as a paradox which cannot be subsumed under any category. A monistic or a dualistic interpretation of the relation between the creator and the creature equally lead to a denial of freedom. Man is not free if he is merely a manifestation of God, a part of the deity. He is not free if he has been endowed with freedom by God the Creator, but has nothing divine in himself, nor is he free if evil has its source in an evil God, in matter upon which he is dependent. All these points of view prove dangerous to man's freedom. The Christian dogma of grace was an attempt to save freedom. Man is not free if God stands to him in the relation of a creator, but he is free if God's relation to him is that of giving him grace. Man is not forced by grace, he receives or rejects it freely. But the doctrine of grace has undergone a change which brought it into conflict with freedom. If grace acts upon man independently of his freedom, we get the doctrine of predestination. The only possible way out is to admit that freedom is uncreated and has its roots in non-being. The more refined forms of atheism, such, for instance, as we find in N. Hartmarm, are based upon the idea that human freedom and creativeness of values are incompatible with the existence of God. If God exists, man is not free and cannot create values. And Hartmann's contention is false, but the problem with which he is struggling is a very real one. It is difficult to reconcile the idea of human freedom with the idea of God's existence, and it is equally difficult to recognize freedom if God does not exist. And Hartmann's ideal values, abstract and impotent, are of no help in this connection. It is unintelligible how man can have freedom if he is merely a part of nature. The paradoxical solution of the problem is that freedom, without which creativeness and moral life are impossible, comes neither from God nor from the created nature. In other words, freedom is uncreated and at the same time it is not divine. The recognition of divine freedom does not in any way solve the question of human freedom. The relationship between grace and freedom is equally paradoxical. So far from diminishing, forcing, or destroying freedom, grace seeks to increase it and raise it to a higher level. The paradoxicality of the problem of freedom and grace is reflected in the disputes between St. Augustine and Pelagius, Thurgencianists and the Jesuits, in Luther's teaching of the slavery of the will and Calvin's doctrine of predestination. Human freedom as such is powerless to turn man to God, to conquer sin, to vanquish its own abysmal darkness and rise above its own destiny. Pelagius failed to understand this. On the other hand, grace comes from God and not from man. And does not mean that man turns to God and conquers evil and darkness. It is not man's answer to God. Failure to see this was the mistake of Calvin and Thurgencianists. The impotence of human freedom and the superhuman nature of grace create an insoluble paradox. The answer to it is contained in the mystery of Christ the God-man, but that mystery cannot be rationalized. In trying to rationalize it, theology makes it meaningless. Only in Christ the God-man does the paradox of the relation between the Creator and the creature find its solution. That is the essence of Christianity. Creator and creature, grace and freedom present an insoluble problem, a tragic conflict, a paradox. The coming of Christ is the answer to it. Such is the theological and anthropological problem which is logically prior to ethics. It throws light on the fall and on the origin of good and evil. Philosophical ethics must inquire not only into the distinct ions and valuations on this side of good and evil, but also into the origin of the distinction between good and evil. The problem of the fall is the fundamental problem of moral philosophy, and without reference to it there can be no ethics. Moral distinctions are the result of the fall. To the fall. The origin of good and evil. Christianity has adopted the myth of the fall and of the Garden of Eden. Thinkers who have given up Christianity and do not want a religious basis for ethics reject it. But the problem of ethics cannot even be formulated unless it be admitted that the distinction between good and evil had an origin in time and had been preceded by a state of being beyond or prior to good and evil. Good and evil are correlative, and in a sense it may be said that good comes into being at the same time as evil and disappears together with it. This is the fundamental paradox of ethics. Paradise is the state of being in which there is no valuation or distinction. It might be said that the world proceeds from an original absence of discrimination between good and evil to a sharp distinction between them, and then, enriched by that experience, ends by not distinguishing them anymore. The memory of a lost paradise, of a golden age, is very deep in man, together with a sense of guilt and sin and a dream of regaining the kingdom of heaven, which sometimes assumes the form of a utopia or an earthly paradise. The kingdom of God is thought of as beyond good and evil. The good which is realized in this sinful world is always based upon distinction and separation from evil. When the good men triumph, they destroy the wicked and finally relegate them to hell. The triumph of a good based upon valuations and distinctions is certainly not paradise or kingdom of God. The kingdom of God cannot be conceived moralistically, it is on the other side of the distinction. It is the fall that made moralists of us. We are faced with a profound enigma. How could man have renounced paradise which he recalls so longingly in our world eon? How could he have fallen away from it? Paradise appears to us as the blissful life in which the cosmos was in man, and man was in God. The exile of man from paradise means that man fell away from God, and the cosmos fell away from man. Paradise was a life of bliss, but was it the fullness of life? Were all the possibilities realized in it? The Bible story has an exoteric character. It expresses in symbols events in the spiritual world, but a deeper interpretation of those symbols is essential. Not everything was revealed to man in paradise, and ignorance was the condition of the life in it. It was the realm of the unconscious. Man's freedom was not as yet unfolded, it had not expressed itself or taken part in creation. When the world was created, meonic freedom, which springs from non-being, was temporarily hidden, but it could not be destroyed. It remained in the subsoil of the paradisaical life and was bound to manifest itself. Man rejected the bliss and wholeness of Eden and chose the pain and tragedy of cosmic life in order to explore his destiny to its inmost depths. This was the birth of consciousness with its painful dividedness. Point 1. In falling away from the harmony of paradise and from unity with God, man began to make distinctions and valuations, tasted the fruit of the tree of knowledge and found himself on the side of good and evil. The prohibition was a warning that the fruits of the tree of knowledge were bitter and deadly. Knowledge was balm out of freedom, out of the dark recesses of the irrational. Man preferred death and the bitterness of discrimination to the blissful and innocent life of ignorance. He could have fed on the fruits of the tree of life and lived forever. One thinkers like Clausius would like us to return to the original paradisaical unconsciousness. The life of unconscious, vegetative bliss. In the innocent life of paradise in which man was nurtured by the tree of life and shunned the tree of knowledge, the relation between the Creator and the creature was limited to the aspect of God as the Father. The divine Trinity was not revealed in paradise, and the Son did not manifest himself in the aspect of infinite love and sacrifice. God was merely a sustaining power. The myth of the Garden of Eden seems to imply that only God the Father was presenter, indeed, not even God the Father, for there can be no Father without the Son, but God as creative force. The paradox of Christian consciousness is that Christ could not have appeared in the life of paradise. True, it may be said that God the Word was present in it, but the Word was not incarnate as man and had not made the sacrifice of love. Life in the Garden of Eden was lived entirely under the Old Testament categories and did not exemplify the divine triunity. If man had remained in the passive state of paradisaical innocence and unconsciousness, i.e., if he had remained at the stage of the divinely natural life, he would not have known Christ or attained deification. The origin of the knowledge of good and evil has two essentially different aspects, and this leads to a paradox. It is possible to interpret the knowledge of good and evil as the fall. Point 1. When I know good and evil, when I make distinctions and valuations, I lose my innocence and wholeness, fall away from God and am exiled from paradise. Knowledge is the loss of paradise. Sin is the attempt to know good and evil. But another interpretation is possible. Knowledge in itself is not a sin and does not mean falling away from God. Knowledge is good and means discovery of meaning. But plucking the fruit of the tree of knowledge indicates an evil and godless experience of life, an attempt on the part of man to return to the darkness of non-being, a refusal to give a creative answer to God's call and resistance to the act of creation. Yet knowledge connected with this act is a manifestation of the principle of wisdom in man, a transition to a higher consciousness and a higher state of existence. It is equally wrong and contradictory to say that the knowledge of good and evil is good and to say that it is evil. Our terms and categories are inapplicable to that which lies beyond the state of being which has given rise to those terms and categories. Is it a good thing that the distinction between good and evil has arisen? Is good good, and evil evil? We are bound to give a paradoxical answer to this question. It is bad that the distinction between good and evil has arisen, but it is good to make the distinction, once it has arisen. 1L. Shestov does this, see his book, N. On the Scales of Job. It is bad to have gone through the experience of evil, but it is good to know good and evil as a result of that experience. When Nietzsche substituted for the distinction between good and evil the distinction between the fine and the low, he thought he was replacing moral and cognitive categories by natural and elemental, i.e., by paradisaical categories. But it was in Eden after the fall. Nietzsche cannot find his way to paradise. Beyond good and evil, i.e., in paradise, there ought to be neither good nor evil in our sense of these terms, but with Nietzsche evil remains. Man has chosen the knowledge of good and evil through experience, and he must follow that painful path to the end. He cannot expect to find paradise halfway. The myth of the lost paradise symbolizes the genesis of consciousness in the development of the spirit. Paradise is the unconscious wholeness of nature, the realm of instinct. There is in it no division between subject and object, no reflection, no painful conflict of consciousness with the unconscious. Dark conflict, which, according to Freud and his school, gives rise to every kind of neurosis and psychosis, is a product of civilization. When Clausius speaks of the birth of consciousness, intellect, and spirit as decadence and disease, he is expressing in scientific and philosophic language the ancient myth of the lost paradise. But he interprets the idea of paradise in naturalistic terms and believes that it can exist in a fallen world. When Bergson contrasts instinct with intellect, he, too, has in mind the paradise which man has lost through the fall. The same idea underlies L. Shestov's struggle against the rational and the good. Consciousness which involves dividedness and loss of wholeness appears to be the result of the fall. We are faced with the fundamental question, is consciousness an indication of man's fallen state? The fruits of the tree of knowledge have proved bitter, and that bitterness has been transferred to the very birth of consciousness. Consciousness is balm in pain and suffering. Consciousness is pain, and loss of consciousness appears to us as the cessation of pain. Dostoevsky says that suffering is the only cause of consciousness. Consciousness involves a painful division. From its very nature it can never embrace the whole of our being, which includes the realm of the subconscious and the superconscious. As modern psychology has shown, consciousness is hampered by the subconscious and closed to the superconscious. The very existence of consciousness involves limits and distinctions which cause pain. In our eon, in the fallen world, consciousness is bound to be pain and suffering. This is why man is so eager to lose himself in ecstasy or intoxication, whether it be of the higher or of the lower kind. Distinctions and valuations made by consciousness always cause pain. After the fall, the forces of meonic pre-existential chaos were let loose, and the image of man could only be preserved through the formation of a clear-cut, limited consciousness. The unconscious was no longer paradisaical, a dark void was formed in it, and consciousness was needed to safeguard man from the yawning abyss below. But consciousness also shuts man off from the superconscious, divine reality, and prevents intuitive contemplation of God. And in seeking to break through to superconsciousness, to the abyss above, man often falls into the subconscious, the abyss below. In our sinful world, consciousness means loss of paradise. But paradise is not completely lost. Its reflections and memories still linger in us. Through dividedness, pain, and suffering, man ascends to wholeness, unattainable for consciousness, to regeneration and bliss in God. Through the experience of evil he reaches the highest good. Hegel speaks of the unhappy consciousness which implies division and for which God is transcendent, but this is true of consciousness as such. Point 1. Unhappy consciousness can only be overcome through superconsciousness. There are 3 stages in the development of the spirit: the original paradisaical wholeness, preconscious wholeness which has not had the experience of thought and of freedom, division, reflection, valuation, freedom of choice, and, finally, superconscious wholeness and completeness that comes after freedom, reflection, and valuation. Those stages cannot, of course, be understood merely chronologically. They express an ideal successiveness. Elemental passion, natural force, is the ungrund, the freedom that is prior to consciousness, reason, goodness, truth, valuation, and choice. Good and evil arise later. The final completeness and wholeness include all the experience that has been lived through the experience of good and evil, of division and valuation, of pain and suffering. Morality inevitably involves pain. There can be no bliss in the good, there can only be bliss beyond good and evil. The origin of good and evil is expressed by a myth, and ethics is bound to have a mythological basis. Both at the beginning and the end, ethics comes upon a realm which lies beyond good and evil, the life of paradise and the life of the kingdom of God, the preconscious and the superconscious state. It is only the unhappy consciousness with its dividedness, reflection, pain, and suffering that is on the side of good and evil. And the most difficult question of all is, what is the nature of the good before the distinction between good and evil has arisen and after it has ceased to be? Is there good in paradise and in the kingdom of God? 1. See an excellent book by Jean Wall, Le Malheur de la conscience dans la philosophique de Hegel. This is the essential metaphysical problem of ethics which is seldom considered. Ethics should be the theory of good and evil, and not of the norms of the good. The problem of evil is as important for ethics as the problem of the good. Traditional theodicy does not really solve the problem of evil. If Satan is entirely subordinate to God and is the instrument of divine providence, if God makes use of him for his own good ends, evil does not really exist. This is an entirely optimistic theory. Evil exists in man only, but in the universe as a whole there is nothing but good. In Leibniz's theodicy, evil does not exist. In Faust, in the prologue in heaven, the theme of which is borrowed from the book of Job, Goethe speaks of God allowing evil for good purposes, for the sake of trying us. This is really the orthodox point of view. Evil as well as good is in God's hands and depends upon him. But this inevitably leads to the conclusion that evil is necessary for the sake of the good. The problem of evil is paradoxical for our consciousness, though rational theology refuses to admit this. The paradox is that either evil depends upon God and is needed for the sake of the good, or it does not depend upon God, and God is powerless before it, and in that case the good is not the supreme ontological force. The paradox springs from the fact that we apply categories of good and evil, i.e., categories engendered by the fall, to divine being which is beyond good and evil. The doctrine of original sin, with which ethics begins, has a very different meaning from the one usually ascribed to it. The myth of the fall does not humiliate man, but extols him to wonderful heights. Modem psychology of the unconscious discovering in man a terrible underworld of darkness and showing the low character of his loftiest state certainly does humiliate man and trample him into mud. But the doctrine of the fall throws a different light upon the underworld that surges up in man, upon the criminal instincts in his subconscious. If man is a fallen creature and if he fell in virtue of freedom inherent in him from the first, it shows that he is a lofty being, a free spirit. Awareness of original sin both humbles and exalts man. Man fell from a height and he can rise to it again. In the consciousness of original sin there is nothing humiliating to man as there is in believing that he has his origin in mud and is essentially a non-entity. The myth of the fall is a myth of man's greatness. But theologians are apt to regard original sin as a kind of hereditary disease. Thus understood, it has nothing to do with the idea of personal responsibility. Just because we carry original sin within us and live in a fallen world doomed to move within the categories of good and evil, our thought is riddled with insoluble paradoxes. If we think deeply and consistently, we are compelled both to identify evil with non-being and to admit its positive significance. Evil is a return to non-being, a rejection of the world, and at the same time it has a positive significance because it calls forth as a reaction against itself the supreme creative power of the good. Freedom of evil is a good thing, and without it there could be no freedom of the good, i.e., the good itself could not exist. The possibility of evil is the condition of the good. A forcible suppression or destruction of evil would be a great evil. And good easily turns into evil. God's toleration. of evil is a paradox which is not sufficiently dwelt upon. God tolerates evil, allows evil for the sake of the good of freedom. Toleration of evil is a part of God's providential plan. With the insight of genius, Jacob Boehme perceived that every principle presupposes for its manifestation its opposite, a principle that wars against it. Light presupposes darkness. Light shines in darkness. The rational does not exist apart from the irrational, and yet the irrational can never be finally rationalized. Light shineth in darkness, and darkness comprehendeth it not, and yet light presupposes the infinity of darkness. It may paradoxically be said that the development of the spirit is connected with sin, with the loss of paradisaical innocence, and at the same time it presupposes a heroic struggle against sin. Kierkegaard says that fear, which he regards as a very important religious phenomenon, is connected with the awakening of spirit. Point 1. The less spirit there is, the less suffering. But fear is a consequence of the fall. So long as there is sin, there is bound to be fear of God, fear of his judgment. And yet fear must be overcome, for perfect love casteth out fear. The genesis of spirit, of consciousness, of valuation and distinction inspires us with unreasoning and groundless fear of the mystery of the divine life from which man has fallen away. Exile from paradise provokes terror which may increase with man's spiritual growth. The world of Greek paganism was not at all a paradise as some would like to paint it. There was incredible fear and terror in it which was never conquered. Man sought to escape from that terror by extinguishing consciousness and returning to the realm of the unconscious. But this is not the way to regain lost paradise. The knowledge of good and evil has poisoned man. He cannot break through to paradise that lies beyond the painful distinction between good and evil, and the suffering connected therewith. Man's fear of God is his fear of himself, of the yawning abyss of non-being in his own nature. Such are the problems and paradoxes of good and evil. We come at once see Kierkegaard, der Begriff der Angst. Every step upon insuperable difficulties and contradictions. We become slaves now of evil and now of good. The good become wicked, the wicked, when menaced with destruction, appeal to the good. Those are the evil fruits of the knowledge of good and evil. Moral tragedy lies first and foremost in the fact that good cannot conquer evil. Normative ethics cannot get beyond this fact. The purpose of life is perpetual creativeness, and not obedience to laws and norms. But good knows of no other way of overcoming evil than through law and norm. There are men who suffer acutely from the problem of evil and pain. This is true of Marcion, of some of the Gnostics and Manichees, of Jacob Boehme and Dostoevsky. Thinkers who are particularly sensitive to the problem of evil may seem to be moralists par excellence, but this requires some explanation. Moralists may be utterly indifferent to the problem of evil and remain perfectly complacent and content with their norms and laws, believing that good is always in the right with regard to the very fact of the existence of evil. Even hell may appear to a moralist as the triumph of the good, for the main problem for him is the justification of the good and not the existence of evil. Marcion and the Gnostics failed to understand freedom, and this accounts for their erroneous belief that the world was created by an evil god, demiurgos. They taught that evil had its roots in material nature which was not created by the God of goodness. Marcion did not understand that the evil world has been created not by God but by sin, and sin springs from freedom and not from an evil god or from matter. Hence came his wrong interpretation of the biblical story of the creation of the world. But there is something essentially noble in the way Marcion and other Gnostics suffered from the problem of evil. Point 1. There is great depth and nobility in the teaching of Boehme, for whom the problem of evil is commiacted with ungrund freedom. Point 2. The sting of the problem is not in the actual existence of evil, but in the difficulty of justifying the good in the face of evil. Do not the good and goodness help to crystallize and to perpetuate evil? The fatal question is whether the good is really good, but the very wording of it is paradoxical. Nietzsche understood the poignancy of the question, but completely failed to grasp the attitude of Christianity towards it. The absolute originality of the Christian teaching lies, in the first place, in the fact that for it the sun rises equally on the evil and on the good, that the first shall. 1. See Harnack's remarkable book on Marcion, Das Evangelium vom Fremden Gott. 2. See my studies in Boehme, in Russian, in No. 20 of Put and A. Coyer's Law Philosophique de Jacob Boehme. Be last and the last first, and that the law of righteousness does not necessarily save, and thus the good becomes problematical. Christian thought is deeply concerned with the relation between God and freedom, between God and goodness, between freedom and value. Is God limited by the moral good and subordinated to it? Is he free in relation to it? Does God will the good, or is the good that which God wills? Duns Scotus defended God's freedom in an extreme form. In answering a wrongly formulated question as to the relation between God and the good, he worked out a conception of God that likens him to a tyrannical Eastern potentate. Eckham went still further. In truth, however, such a question cannot be asked. It is equally wrong to say that God is bound to will the good and that the good is that which God wills. We cannot judge of God from our side of the distinction between good and evil. If theodicy passes judgment on God from the point of view of the good that has come into being after the fall, it is on a wrong track. Theodicy should seek to justify God by accounting for the origin of the distinction between good and evil. It is obvious that God is beyond good and evil, for on this side of it is our fallen world and certainly not God. God is above good. And there cannot be in him any evil that is on this side of the distinction. When we ask whether God is free to will evil, we apply to him the categories of our fallen world. One can only think of the subject in terms of negative theology. God certainly is not bound by the moral good and is not dependent upon it. He is the good as an absolute force. But we have at once to add that he is above good, for the category of goodness is not applicable to him. It is impossible to pass judgment on God, for he is the source of all values by reference to which we judge. God reveals himself to us as the source of values, as infinite love. Theodicy can judge God only in the light of what God has revealed to us about himself. It defends God against human conceptions of him, against human slander. The problem of the relation between freedom and values is even more troublesome. It may be said that man in his freedom is confronted with ideal norms or values which he has to realize. His failure to do so is an evil. This is the usual point of view. Man is free to realize the good or the values which stand above him as forever laid down by God, forming an ideal normative world, but he is not free to create the good, to produce values. The scholastic conception of free will comes precisely to this: that man can and must fulfill the law of goodness, and if he fails to do so, it is his own fault and he is punished. This choice between good and evil is forced upon him from without. Freedom of will is not a source of creativeness, but of responsibility and possible punishment. This purely normative conception has been specially worked out for legal purposes. True freedom, however, consists not in fulfilling the law, but in creating new realities and values. As a free being, man is not merely a servant of the moral law, but a creator of new values. Man is called upon to create the good and not only to fulfill it. Creative freedom gives rise to values. As a free being, a free spirit, man is called to be the creator of new values. The world of values is not a changeless ideal realm rising above man and freedom. It is constantly undergoing change and being created afresh. Man is free in relation to moral values, not merely in the sense that he is free to realize or not to realize them. Similarly, in relation to God, man is free not merely in the sense that he can turn towards God or away from him, can fulfill or not fulfill his will. Man is free in the sense of being able to cooperate with God, to create the good and produce new values. Hence a system of ethics is needed which interprets moral life as a creative activity. There are no superhuman or non-human ideal values, changeless and eternal. Creative gifts and values are dynamic, and through them the creation of the world is going on. The new ethics rooted in Christianity must go beyond the conception of ideal norms. Platonism cannot be the basis of a creative morality. The teleological point of view must be transcended also. The fundamental question is to determine not the purpose, whether immanent or imposed upon us from without, which our moral life ought to subserve, but the source of the creative energy which is realized in our life. The teleological point of view enslaves man as a creative being. Anne Hartman thinks that a teleological interpretation of the natural world, according to which a higher purpose is being realized in it, is incompatible with freedom and moral life. But it may equally well be said that Hartman's conception of ideal values which man must freely realize in the world is incompatible with freedom and moral life. That, too, is a teleological conception, though of a different type. In truth, purpose is posited in and through a free creative act, values are created by man. The first question, therefore, is to determine what is man, whence he comes and what is his goal. These are problems of philosophical anthropology which have as yet been scarcely worked out. Anne Hartman's philosophy does not explain what man is and what is the origin of his freedom. Ethics brings us up against two conceptions of life, One is duration in time, bad infinity, endless longing and torment. The other is eternity, divine infinity, victory over time. It is a mistake to imagine that creativeness leads to bad infinity. Creative activity may bring us into eternity, and eternity may be creative and dynamic. Chapter 3 Man I. The problems of philosophical anthropology. Types of anthropological theory. Max Scheler, who is more interested than other philosophers in the problem of anthropology, says, Zeukienerzeit der Geschichte der Mensch sich so problematisch geworden ist, wie in der Gegenwart. This means that the time has come to formulate a philosophical anthropology which has not existed in the past. Man has begun to feel uneasy about himself. Psychology, biology, and sociology have not solved the problem of man. Man has been approached from various points of view and studied in parts. The name of anthropology is applied to a science which throws least light upon man as such. And yet a philosophical anthropology must be the basis of ethics. Indeed, the problem of man is fundamental for philosophy as a whole. The ancient Greeks understood that man can only begin to philosophize through knowing himself. The key to reality is to be found in man. The analysis of knowledge shows that man is quite a special kind of being, not on a par with other realities. Man is not a fragmentary part of the world but contains the whole riddle of the universe and the solution of it. The fact that man as an object of knowledge is at the same time the knower has an anthropological as well as an epistemological significance. I have already said in the first chapter that we cannot substitute for the problem of man the problem of the epistemological subject or the transcendental consciousness, or the problem of the psychical consciousness, or of the spirit, of ideal values and ideas of goodness, truth, beauty, etc. Man is neither the epistemological subject, nor the soul of psychology, nor a spirit, nor an ideal value of ethics, logics, or aesthetics. All spheres of being intersect in man. Philosophy must get rid of psychologism, but it cannot get rid of man. Philosophy must be consciously and not instinctively anthropological. Man is a profound riddle to himself, for he bears witness to the existence of a higher world. The superhuman principle is a constituent element of man's nature. Man is discontented with himself and capable of outone his die Stellung der Menschen im Kosmos. Growing himself. The very fact of the existence of man is a break in the natural world and proves that nature cannot be self-sufficient but rests upon a supernatural reality. As an entity belonging to two worlds and capable of outgrowing himself, man is a self-contradictory and paradoxical being, combining opposite poles within himself. With equal justice he may be said to be base and lofty, weak and strong, free and slavish. The enigmatic and contradictory nature of man is due not only to the fact that he is a fallen creature, an earthly being preserving memories of heaven and reflections of a heavenly light. A still deeper reason for it is that man is the child of God and of non-being, of meonic freedom. His roots are in heaven, in God, and also in nethermost depths. Man is not merely a product of the natural world, although he lives in it and participates in the processes of nature. He is dependent upon his natural environment and at the same time he humanizes it and introduces a new principle into it. Point 1. Man's creative activity has significance for the whole world and indicates a new stage of cosmic life. Man is a new departure in nature. The problem of man is utterly insoluble if man be considered merely as a part of nature and correlative to it. He can only be interpreted through his relation to God, he can only be understood through the higher and not through the lower. Consequently, it is only the religious consciousness that has really tried to grapple with the problem of man. All theological doctrines deal with it. There exists no philosophical anthropology in the true sense of the term, but there has always been a religious anthropology. The Christian teaching is that man is a being created by God in his image and likeness, free, but through his freedom fallen away from God, and in his fallen and sinful state receiving from God grace that saves and regenerates him. The conception of man is slightly different in the Catholic, the Protestant and the Orthodox theology. According to the Catholic view, man has been created as a natural being, lacking in the supernatural gifts of the contemplation of God and communion with him. The supernatural gifts were bestowed upon him by a special act of grace. Point 2. Through the fall man lost precisely those supernatural gifts, but as a natural being he suffered comparatively little damage. Such a view does not do justice to the divine image and likeness in man and may lead to a purely naturalistic interpretation of human nature. The naturalistic element is very strong in the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas, who tends to regard man as a non-spiritual being. According to the classical Protestant conception, the one C. Edouard Leroy, les origines humaines et involution de l'intelligence. Tout c'est banal, naturel et surnaturel. Fall has completely ruined and distorted human nature, darkened man's reason, deprived him of freedom and made all his life completely dependent upon grace. From such a point of view human nature can never be hallowed and transfigured, so that naturalism is victorious once more, though, so to speak, from another end. The orthodox view of man has been but little worked out, but the central point in it is the doctrine of the divine image and likeness in man, the doctrine, i.e., that man has been created as a spiritual being. The godlike and spiritual life of man is not destroyed but merely damaged by the fall, and the image of God in man is dimmed. This point of view is the very opposite of naturalism. Christian anthropology teaches not only of the old Adam but also of the new Adam, of Christ the God-man, and is therefore a divinely human anthropology. Its central idea is that of the God-man. Man is a being created by God, fallen away from God and receiving grace from God. This is the essence of Christian anthropology. It takes a humble view of man as creature and makes more of the idea of sin than of the divine image and likeness. But Christian thought does face the problem of man and clearly sees what a paradoxical being man is, and in this respect it is infinitely superior to all philosophic theories of man. Man is a tragic being, and the tragic element in him makes him ill-adapted to the world in which he lives. Man is in conflict not only with the world but with himself. His tragedy is, as we have seen, not merely a struggle between good and evil but something still deeper, a conflict between values which are equally good. Man is a being who humanizes nature, but he also humanizes the idea of God, and through this humanizes himself. Skeeler has established 4 types of anthropological theory: I, the Jewish Christian, the creation of man by God and the fall; 2, the ancient Greek conception of man as the bearer of reason; 3, the natural science view of man as the product of the evolution in the animal world; 4, the decadence theory which regards the birth of consciousness, reason, and spirit as biological retrogression, a weakening of life. The latter point of view is expressed most clearly by Clausius, who says was sich in der Ekstase befreie. Wir antworten, die Sieg. Dies wo von es sich befreie. Vom Geist. 1. Although Clausius is influenced by Bachofen, M. Skeeler is wrong in including Bachofen among the founders of the decadence theory. Bachofen was a Christian and regarded the birth of the spirit, the awakening of personality, the victory of the solar masculine principle over the tellurgic feminine as a tremendous gain and achievement. 2. Nietzsche s. 1. Clausius, vom Kosmogenisken Eros. 2. See his Mutter Recht, a work of genius. Conception of man may also be classed in a sense with the decadence theories. Clausius is compelled to regard the very emergence of man as a retrogression. Nietzsche also wants to rise beyond man and return to the ancient demigod, to the hero Superman. Skeeler admirably shows that man's superiority cannot be defended on biological grounds. Biologically man does not differ from animals, he only differs from them in virtue of the principle which is superior to that of life, the spirit. 1. Man is human only as the bearer of spirit which manifests itself in personality. Man is a being who transcends himself and the world. He is a continual protest against reality. Skeeler draws a sharp distinction between life and spirit. Spirit moves in a direction that cuts across the temporal flux of life. Spirit brings ideas into life. For M. Skeeler, however, spirit is not active but completely passive, and he does not believe in freedom. Life is active, but spirit is very similar to the ideal values which life has to realize. The presence of spirit in man greatly complicates the question of man's evolution. From the biological point of view, man regresses rather than progresses. He is a divided and weakened being, there can be no doubt of that. Consciousness has weakened in man the power of instinct and made him biologically defenseless. His organs have not been perfected but weakened by the growth of civilization. He has to think with regret of his lost primeval strength. His organs for attack and defense have become social instead of biological, he relies upon his social environment and its weapons. But this means that his strength has ceased to be biologically hereditary. From the purely biological point of view, man does not progress, his progress consists in an increasing power of consciousness and spirit on the one hand, and in social and technical achievements on the other. But that means that man's wholeness is broken up more and more, and he becomes more and more divided within himself. We shall see how deep that division is when we consider the conflict between civilization and instinct. That conflict is becoming obvious to modern science and philosophy, and utterly disproves the theories of progress and evolution that were predominant in the 19th century. The naturalistic view of man as a product of evolution in the animal world is the feeblest of all anthropological theories. But the ancient Greek conception of man as the bearer of reason is not valid either. The Greek philosophy wanted to discover in man the supreme and eternal principle of reason which rises above the changing world. There is undoubtedly an element of truth in this view, but it has been vulgarized by one M. Skeeler,